The doorbell rang at exactly 2 a.m. The sharp chime pierced through the quiet of the night, yanking me from a restless sleep. At first, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe it was a fragment of a dream slipping into reality. But then it rang again, crisp and clear, echoing through the empty hallways of my home. I groaned, rubbing my eyes as I rolled out of bed. Stumbling toward the front door, I checked through the peephole. Nothing but the empty porch under the glow of the streetlights. Annoyed, I opened the door, expecting to catch a prankster running off into the night. The street was still, eerily silent. No footprints, no rustling leaves, not even a stray breeze to explain the disturbance. Just an empty night staring back at me. The first change. The next morning, as I walked into the kitchen, I stopped short. The magnets on my fridge, once scattered haphazardly, were arranged in a perfect circle. I frowned, trying to recall if I had done that the night before. No, I hadn't. I liked my mess. It was comfortable. Something felt off. The pattern emerges. By the second night, I was waiting. When the doorbell rang again at exactly 2 a.m., I was at the door within seconds. But once again, nothing. I searched the entire house. Everything seemed in place. But in the morning, another change. Every pair of shoes in my closet, once jumbled together, was now neatly arranged by color and size. Even the dusty old boots I hadn't touched in months were lined up perfectly. The haunting begins. By the third night, I was done playing games. I set up my phone to record. The doorbell rang. I checked the footage. The camera showed my front door unmoving. No one approached, no movement, nothing at all. But the bell had rung. The next morning, I found all my books reversed on their shelves. And that was just the beginning. The obsession grows night after night. The doorbell rang, and something in my home changed, sometimes subtle. A chair moved, a curtain slightly askew, other times more drastic. Every framed photo turned to face the wall, all the clocks in the house set 3 minutes slow. I stopped sleeping properly. I started staying awake, watching, waiting. I tried everything. Disconnecting the doorbell, replacing it, cutting the power. But every night the chime rang through the house. I invited a friend over. He heard it too. We searched the house together but found no intruders. The next morning, I discovered my toothbrush frozen solid in a glass of water inside the freezer. The changes weren't random. They were messages. And all of them pointed back to my childhood, to my sister, the magnets in a circle, our childhood game, the color-coded shoes, her obsessive organization, the reversed books, her way of hiding her diary. And then the final night came. At 2 a.m., I didn't check the door. Instead, I sat in her old room waiting. The doorbell rang, a whisper of footsteps in the hallway, light, hesitant, like a child in socks. I closed my eyes. "I know it's you," I whispered. "I'm sorry, I should have saved you." The room fell silent, the air grew heavy, and then, a cold touch against my hand, light, barely there. I opened my eyes. The bed beside me shifted as if someone small had just sat down. But nothing was there. Only a single object placed gently on the pillow beside mine. Her old inhaler. The next night, the doorbell did not ring, nor the night after, nor any night since. But sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, I hear it, the faintest sound of laughter from the guest room. And each morning, I find one tiny thing changed. Not an accusation anymore, just a reminder that I am not alone. One night, I woke to a different sound. Not the doorbell, but a whisper, a voice I didn't recognize. "Why didn't you help?" I shot up, heart pounding. I wasn't alone. Someone was in the room. I reached for my phone, its glow illuminating the space. Nothing. But then the closet door creaked open. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't opened it, and yet in the dim light, I could see something, no, someone, standing there. A figure, barely visible, watching. I turned on the lamp, but the second the light filled the room, the figure was gone. The closet was empty. But there was something new lying on the floor, a photograph. It was an old picture of me and my sister. Only now, her face was scratched out. The changes became more violent. The kitchen chairs overturned. Deep scratches appeared on the walls. I woke with bruises I couldn't explain. And then, the whispering started again. Not just my sister's voice. Others. Voices I didn't recognize. Some pleading, some laughing, some crying. I wasn't just haunted. I was being watched. I reached out to an expert, a paranormal investigator. When I told him my story, he was silent for a long time before finally saying, "You're not dealing with just your sister anymore. Something else has taken notice." That night, I left the house. I checked into a hotel, but at 2 a.m., my phone rang. I picked it up with shaking hands. A child's laughter. Then the call disconnected. I returned home the next day to find every mirror covered in cloth. Every clock stopped at 2 a.m. And on my bed, another photograph. This time I was alone in it. My sister was gone. And so was my reflection in the mirror across the room. I didn't sleep that night. The hotel room was quiet, but my mind was a hurricane. The missing reflection, the photograph where I stood alone, something was wrong, something deeper than a haunting. At exactly 2 a.m. I heard it. Not the doorbell, not a whisper, but breathing, heavy, labored, right beside my bed. I held my breath, heart hammering in my chest. I reached for my phone, the screen lighting up the dark room, and there, just outside my bed, the outline of a figure. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, a person, standing, watching. I swung my phone's flashlight up, but there was nothing. The breathing stopped, the room fell silent, and yet I knew I wasn't alone. The next morning I called again. Something's wrong, I told him. It's not just my sister anymore. I know, he said. I've been researching your case. He hesitated, then added, and I need to tell you something. You're not the first. My stomach turned. What do you mean? There are records of this before, the same pattern, the doorbell, the changes in the house, the messages, but it always ends the same way. I swallowed hard. How does it end? He sighed. They disappear. I didn't want to believe him, but something inside me knew he was right. My house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. Digging through old records, I found a newspaper article from decades ago. A family had lived here before me, a father, a mother, and their young daughter. The girl had died, at exactly 2 a.m., just like my sister. And then, weeks later, the parents vanished without a trace. Their house left empty, abandoned. I sat there staring at the yellowed paper in my hands, dread pooling in my stomach. I wasn't just dealing with ghosts, I was next. That night called me first. Listen, there's one thing that might work, he said, a cleansing ritual, but you need to do exactly as I say. Okay, I said, gripping the phone. Tell me. He gave me the instructions, salt, fire, an offering of something personal. And most importantly, I had to face whatever was in the house. No running, no hiding. I had to confront it. At 1:59 a.m., I stood in the center of my living room, a ring of salt around me, a candle burning in my shaking hands. The air was thick, pressing down on my lungs. Then the doorbell rang. I didn't move. I didn't check. Instead, I whispered, I know you're here. I know what you want. The candle flickered violently. The shadows in the room stretched, twisting unnaturally. And then the whispering began. Voices, dozens of them. My sister, the little girl, the parents. Others I didn't recognize, some begging, some screaming, some laughing. I closed my eyes. You don't control me, I said. You never did. The house shook. The walls groaned. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the candle had gone out. The room was still, and the doorbell never rang again. Days passed, then weeks. The house remained quiet. No changes, no whispers. But I wasn't the same. I kept the old photograph, the one where my sister had been erased. Every morning I checked it, and then, one day, she was back. Not a ghost, not a memory, just a photograph, as if she had never left at all. I called one last time. I think it's over, I told him. There was a long pause. Then he said, maybe, but be careful. Why? Because sometimes things don't really leave, they just wait. I hung up, staring at my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in months, I felt normal again, but as I turned away, something in the reflection moved. Not me, something else, watching, waiting. And then, in the dead silence of the night, a sound I never wanted to hear again. The doorbell, ringing, at exactly 2 a.m. I stood frozen, staring at the front door. The doorbell's chime still echoed in my ears. This wasn't over. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and called. He answered on the first ring. It's back, I whispered. I know, he said, his voice tense. I had a feeling. My skin prickled. What do I do? There was a pause. Then he said, this isn't just a ghost. This is something worse. And it's not just after you anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the basement door. I had never paid much attention to it before, but something about it felt wrong tonight. The moment I touched the handle, an icy sensation spread through my fingers. The door creaked open, revealing a set of stairs leading into suffocating darkness. My phone buzzed, a message from him. Don't go down alone. Too late. I descended one slow step at a time. My flashlight flickered. The deeper I went, the colder it got. And then, I saw them. Hands. Pale, skeletal fingers reaching out from the shadows between the wooden beams, grasping at the air. Whispers filled the room, overlapping, growing louder. A chorus of the forgotten, and then a voice rose above the rest, clear and sharp. "You let me die." My sister's voice. I spun around, heart pounding. The flashlight beam landed on something I had never noticed before, a door at the far end of the basement, old and rotting. It wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped closer, ignoring the icy fear crawling up my spine. Something scratched against the wood from the other side. I reached out. The doorbell rang upstairs. I bolted back up the stairs, slammed the basement door shut, and locked it. Breathing heavily, I turned back toward the front door. And froze. The front door was wide open. A figure stood just beyond the threshold. Not a person, not my sister. Something else. Something wearing my face. I backed away as the figure stepped forward. Its features were identical to mine. Same height, same build, same eyes. But its smile was too wide, its movements too unnatural. "Let me in," it whispered. I shook my head. "You're not real," it cocked its head. "Neither are you." The air around me shifted, the room distorted. My vision blurred, like reality itself was unraveling. And then, I wasn't in my house anymore. I was standing in my childhood bedroom, the night my sister died. I turned. My sister lay in bed, pale and struggling to breathe. The room was exactly as I remembered it. I moved closer, reaching for her, but my hands passed right through. I wasn't really here. A voice whispered behind me. She was never the only one. I turned sharply. My doppelganger stood in the corner, grinning. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. It stepped closer. "There was another, before her, before you." My stomach twisted. "No." "Yes." Memories surfaced, flashes of moments I had buried deep. Another child, another sibling, one I had forgotten, one the house had taken before my sister. The doorbell was never for her, it was for me. The room around me flickered, the walls bending and shifting. I felt myself being pulled between two realities, the past and the present. And then my sister turned her head. Her eyes met mine. "You can stop it," she whispered, "but you have to choose." The doppelganger stepped closer, its grin stretching unnaturally wide. "Or you can stay. With us." The doorbell rang one last time. I reached for my sister's hand, and everything went dark. I woke up in my bed. The house was silent, no whispers, no shadows, no doorbell. I checked the time. 2:01 a.m. had passed. I exhaled sharply, sitting up. Then I noticed it. On my nightstand sat an old photograph, one I had never seen before. It showed my sister and me, and another child. A boy. His face blurred. My forgotten brother. I picked up the photo, my hands shaking, and then a whisper brushed against my ear. "I'm still here." The whisper sent a jolt of ice through my veins. My eyes darted around the dimly lit room, searching for the source. The photo trembled in my hands. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The air in the room grew thick, pressing against my skin. The walls seemed to pulse like something was breathing within them. Then the closet door creaked open. I stared at the darkness within. A shape loomed in the shadows. Not human, not quite real. A hand, too long and too thin, stretched out from the void. Its fingers curled, beckoning. "Come remember," it rasped. I scrambled back against the bed, heart hammering. My phone buzzed violently on the nightstand. A message from him. "Don't go into the closet." I swallowed hard. "Why?" I texted back with shaking hands. The reply came instantly. "Because it's not a closet. It's a door." "A door to where?" The house groaned. The air vibrated, charged with something ancient. I knew without a doubt that if I stepped inside, I might never come back. And yet, a part of me wanted to. The voice from the darkness grew more urgent. "You left me. You forgot." I shut my eyes. The memories were surfacing. Ones I didn't recognize, ones I had no reason to have. A third child, a name just on the edge of my mind. Something terrible happened in this house long before my sister died. Something erased from history. I turned to the closet. No, the door. It stood wide open now. And on the other side was not darkness, but another room. A room I had never seen before. Yet somehow, I knew it had always been there. I stepped forward. Cold, stale air wrapped around me like a burial shroud. Inside, the room was untouched by time. Toys lay scattered on the floor. A bed with a dust-covered blanket sat against the wall. A single book rested on the nightstand. I picked it up. The pages flipped on their own, stopping on a name written in a child's handwriting. Ethan. I whispered it aloud. The walls trembled. The door slammed shut behind me. And then, the whisper turned into a scream. The room lurched violently, like the entire house had been ripped from the ground. I staggered, gripping the nightstand for balance. Something was shifting in the shadows. I turned slowly, my breath shallow. A mirror stood in the corner, tall and cracked, and in its reflection, I saw him. A boy, no older than 6, standing right behind me. His face was pale, hollow, his eyes sunken with years of sorrow. "You forgot me," he whispered. The mirror shattered, and the house began to collapse around me. The house was tearing itself apart. The walls groaned, the floor buckled beneath me. Wind howled through unseen cracks, carrying whispers that clawed at my mind. I ran for the door, but it was gone. Nothing but an endless stretch of darkness beyond the walls. I turned back to the mirror, its shards now floating midair, swirling in an unseen force, and there, amidst the reflections of chaos, stood Ethan. "You can't leave yet," he murmured. A sudden force yanked me backward. The room distorted, stretching into an impossible corridor lined with doors, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of things I shouldn't see. My childhood bedroom, untouched since I moved out, my parents' old house, the night of the funeral, my sister's hospital bed, then a door at the very end, blackened, burned, as if it had survived a fire. I knew, whatever was behind it held the truth. I hesitated, my pulse pounding in my ears. Ethan's voice slithered through the cracks. "You forgot me, but I remember everything." The door handle was cold, almost searing. I turned it. Beyond was not a room. It was a night, a memory I had buried so deep even time itself had struggled to keep it hidden. Flames flickered in the distance. A house, our house, was burning, and in the middle of it all, 2 small figures stood holding hands. Me and him. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Ethan wasn't just another child who had lived here before. He was my brother. A twin I had forgotten. My hands shook. The burning house in front of me was the old version of this place, before the renovation, before we moved back in years later. But why? How had I forgotten an entire person? Ethan turned to me, his pale face lit by the fire's glow. "You left me there." The flames surged forward, engulfing everything, and then I woke up. I gasped for air, my room spinning around me. 2 a.m. The doorbell was ringing. I ran to the front door, yanking it open. Nothing, no one, but on the porch where no fire had ever touched, the wood was scorched. A single child-sized footprint burned into the floorboards. Ethan was real, and he wasn't done with me yet. I stumbled back from the burned footprint, my breath shallow. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. The truth was undeniable now. Ethan had been real, my twin, my brother, and I had forgotten him. The doorbell rang again, louder, more insistent. The house trembled as if groaning under an unbearable weight. I had spent years ignoring the signs, dismissing the whispers, rewriting my own past, but Ethan had never forgotten. He had spent all this time trying to reach me, and now he had. I turned slowly, my hands cold with sweat. The hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, impossibly dark, and in that darkness something moved. A silhouette stood at the end, just barely visible, small, thin, a child's shape. "Ethan, you left me," he whispered. "You let me burn." The lights flickered, and the hallway seemed to shrink, pressing in on me. My head throbbed as memories clawed their way back. The fire, the screams, the locked door I had failed to open. I ran, not away, but toward him. The house shifted, its walls breathing, twisting. The hallway ended where it shouldn't have, a door appearing where none had ever been before. I knew what it was before I even touched the handle. Ethan's room. I stepped inside and the past swallowed me whole. The room was untouched by time. Toys were still scattered on the floor. The bed was unmade, sheets crumpled as if someone had just climbed out of them. And in the center of the room, a small, charred teddy bear sat upright, staring at me with blackened button eyes. My knees buckled. I remembered now. The fire had started in this room. A candle knocked over. Flames crawling up the walls, consuming everything. I had heard Ethan crying, begging for me to help, but I had been too afraid. I had run. The walls trembled, the air thickened. The teddy bear toppled forward, and a voice, Ethan's voice, echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "You remember now." The door slammed shut behind me. The shadows in the room deepened, shifting, coiling. The air smelled of smoke, of burned flesh, and then a hand, small, cold, closed around my wrist. I looked up. Ethan stood there, half in shadow, his eyes hollow, his skin flickering between pale and charred. "Come with me," he whispered. "Let's finish what we started." Ethan's grip tightened around my wrist, and suddenly the walls of his room warped and blackened. The air thickened with the acrid stench of smoke. I coughed, my lungs burning. Flames flickered in the corners of the room, creeping toward us. "Come with me," he repeated, his voice both pleading and commanding. His eyes reflected the fire that had once consumed him. "Ethan, My voice caught in my throat. I tried to pull away, but his fingers locked around me like iron. "You ran once. You don't get to run again." The walls groaned, and the house itself seemed to convulse. The fire spread unnaturally, moving against the flow of air, as if drawn by Ethan's will. The pictures on the walls warped, shifting to show images I had never seen before. Me, as a child, standing beside Ethan. Us playing in the backyard. Us blowing out birthday candles together. Images I had erased. But the house remembered, and now it wanted me to pay. A gust of wind shattered the window, sending shards of glass flying through the room, but instead of reflecting the flames, the shards showed something else. A different version of the room. No fire, no destruction, just a quiet, peaceful bedroom, untouched by time. A voice whispered from the broken glass, "There's still a way." Ethan turned sharply, his grip loosening just enough for me to yank free. I stumbled backward, toward the largest shard still wedged in the window frame. I saw my own reflection staring back. But behind me, Ethan's reflection was different. Not burned, not angry, just a boy. A lost, forgotten boy. "Ethan, we can fix this," I said. "But not like this." The fire roared louder. Ethan's eyes darkened. "You don't get to choose anymore." The room exploded in a surge of flames. I barely had time to react. The fire swallowed everything, but in that last second, I lunged forward. Not toward Ethan, toward the mirror. The glass shattered as I crashed through it, and for a moment I was falling, until I landed hard on the wooden floor of my bedroom. The fire was gone. The air was cold. The house was silent, and Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I sat up, my breath ragged. My hands trembled as I reached for the clock on my nightstand. 2 a.m. The doorbell rang. I stood on unsteady legs, heart hammering. Slowly I made my way to the front door, every step echoing through the empty house. I placed my hand on the knob, hesitating. And then for the first time, I did something different. I didn't open it. Instead, I whispered, "Goodbye, Ethan." The air shifted. The house exhaled. The weight of years lifted from my shoulders. The doorbell never rang again. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No doorbell, no strange rearrangements, no whispers in the dark. But when I woke up, something felt wrong. The silence was too thick, too absolute. No birds chirping outside, no distant hum of traffic. Just an unnatural stillness, as if the world had been paused. I hesitated before stepping out of bed. My skin prickled with unease. I checked my phone. 2 a.m. My heart sank. That wasn't possible. I had just woken up. Then the doorbell rang. I ran to the window and peered out. My street looked different. The trees were taller, their branches twisted unnaturally. The houses had windows in places they shouldn't. The streetlights flickered erratically. And then I saw him. Ethan, standing at the end of my driveway, staring up at my house. I stepped back from the window, pulse hammering. My house was supposed to be normal again. I had said goodbye. So why was he still here? A slow creak echoed behind me. My bedroom door. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The door was slightly open, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. And then, the mirror across the room began to change. My reflection wasn't mine. It was Ethan's. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed at me. The glass cracked, a jagged web spreading outward. I backed away, shaking my head. "No, this isn't real. You're gone." The cracks widened, the reflection twisted, Ethan's mouth opened, and the sound of the doorbell exploded through the room, deafening and relentless. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the ringing wouldn't stop. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. The walls groaned, shifting as if the house itself was breathing. I wasn't alone. I could feel it now. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Something moved in the corner of my vision, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. The floorboards bent beneath unseen footsteps. Then, from behind me, a whisper. "You never left." I turned, but there was nothing, just my empty room. But the whisper came again, this time closer. "You never left." I ran out of my room, down the hallway. The house was warping around me, ceilings stretching, doors shifting locations. I reached the living room, but something stopped me in my tracks. The floorboards were pulsing, rising, as if something underneath was trying to break free. The whisper became a chorus. You never left. You never left. You never left. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I reached for the floor, hesitating. Then, as if obeying an unseen force, the floorboards cracked open. Something was buried beneath my house, and it was waking up. I didn't want to look, but something compelled me. The split floorboards gaped open like a wound, exposing the darkness beneath my house. A terrible smell rose up, damp earth and something metallic like rusted iron or old blood. My hands trembled as I grabbed a flashlight from the nearby table. I hesitated for only a second before aiming the beam into the hole, and then I saw them. Fingers, not skeletal, not decomposed, pale, unmoving fingers, pressed together like someone was reaching up from the darkness, but they weren't human. The proportions were wrong, too long, too slender. Then, they twitched. I staggered back, heart slamming against my ribs. The fingers moved again, flexing like they were testing their strength. The whispering grew louder, but now it wasn't just one voice, it was a chorus. You never left, you never left, you never left. The floorboards began to shift on their own, widening the gap. I scrambled backward, my flashlight shaking in my grip, and then something began to pull itself up. I bolted for the door, but the house wouldn't let me leave. The walls stretched, elongating like melted wax. The front door receded down a hallway that hadn't existed before. And then, a figure stepped out from the darkness. Ethan. But it wasn't Ethan. Not really. His skin was too pale, his eyes too black. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Only a dry, scraping noise, like something shifting in the attic. Behind him, more shapes emerged. Shadowy figures, tall and thin, their limbs too long for their bodies. You never left, they whispered together, their voices merging into a single, unnatural sound. You have to finish it. The realization hit me like ice water. They weren't trying to haunt me. They were trying to keep me here. I had unfinished business, something I had buried deep, just like the thing beneath my floor. Ethan stepped closer, his empty eyes boring into mine. You buried it. You tried to forget, but the house never forgets. I shook my head. I don't know what you're talking about. He tilted his head. Then why is it waking up? A deep guttural groan rumbled beneath my feet. The floor trembled. Whatever was under the house was coming. The floor groaned beneath me, the boards bowing as if something massive was pressing upward from below. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The walls seemed to breathe. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. Ethan, or whatever was wearing his face, just stood there watching me. Then the whispering changed. It's waking up! It's waking up! It's waking up! The figures in the shadows swayed, their long fingers twitching in unison. The darkness behind them deepened, pulsing like a living thing. I turned and ran. I sprinted toward the front door, but the hallway stretched on, growing longer and darker. The air thickened, pressing against me like an invisible tide. My legs burned, but the door remained impossibly far away. A voice, barely a whisper, slithered into my ear. You buried it. I whirled around. The figures were closer now, surrounding me. Their hollow eyes shimmered with something wet, something hungry. The house shuddered. A deep, guttural noise echoed from beneath the floorboards. I had to get out. I had to. Then, the ceiling cracked open. A jagged fissure split the ceiling and something black and viscous began to seep through. It dripped in thick tendrils, stretching toward the floor. Then a hand emerged. Not a human hand. It was too large, the fingers too many. The skin, if it could even be called that, was gray and waxy, pulsating with veins that glowed faintly in the dim light. The figures in the shadows whispered as one, You never left, you never left, you never left. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened as the hand flexed, gripping the broken ceiling. More of the thing pulled itself free, a twisted mass of limbs and mouths, writhing and shifting as if it couldn't decide what shape to take. And then it spoke, not in words, not in sound, but directly into my head. I remember you. Memories flooded back, unbidden and sharp. The night my sister died. The night I heard her breathing change, but I ignored it. The night I told myself it wasn't my fault. But there was more. Something I had pushed so deep into my subconscious, I had forgotten it entirely. The basement, the old wooden chest, the thing we found inside when we were children, the thing we let out. My sister had always known. She tried to warn me. She tried to make me remember. And now, it was here for me. The floorboards snapped beneath my feet. I was falling. The darkness swallowed me whole. I hit the ground hard, my breath exploding from my lungs. Dirt and dust filled my mouth, choking me as I scrambled to my feet. The air down here was thick, suffocating, laced with the scent of decay. Above me, the hole in the ceiling was gone. The house had sealed itself shut. I wasn't getting out. A sound slithered through the blackness, a wet, dragging sound. Then breathing, slow, deep, inhuman. I turned, lifting my flashlight with shaking hands. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing damp stone walls covered in strange carvings. Symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep as if by clawed hands. The breathing grew louder. I forced myself to move, stepping carefully over broken floorboards and something else, something that crunched underfoot. Bones, tiny ones. Then the whispering started again. "You let it out! You let it out! You let it out!" My flashlight flickered. My pulse pounded in my ears as I swung the beam wildly, searching for the source of the sound. The walls shifted, not physically, but they felt closer. The carvings seemed to twist, their meanings pressing against my mind, trying to force their way in. Then, ahead, a door. It was old, ancient, the wood blackened with time. Chains hung loosely from the handles, as if they had once been wrapped tightly but had since been broken. My stomach turned. I had seen this door before, in my dreams, in my nightmares. My fingers brushed the wood and it was warm. Something thumped on the other side, hard enough to shake the ground. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. The whispering grew urgent. "You buried it! You buried it! You buried it!" Another thump, louder. The chains rattled. Then, the door began to open. A crack at first, then wider, and from the darkness beyond something moved, a shape massive and twisted, unfolding itself like it had been waiting for this moment. Eyes, too many eyes, staring directly at me. A sound filled the space. Not a roar, not a growl. Laughter, deep, mocking, hungry. I took a step back, and the thing surged forward. The thing lunged. I turned and ran, my flashlight swinging wildly in my grip. Shadows leapt and twisted, distorting the narrow stone passage ahead. The whispering voices rose to a deafening chorus, but I couldn't understand them anymore. They weren't speaking to me, they were speaking to it. Heavy, wet footsteps slammed against the floor behind me. It was close, too close. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but the tunnel stretched endlessly before me, as if I were running in place. Then, a doorway. I threw myself through it, slamming the ancient wood behind me. My fingers fumbled with the rusted lock, twisting it shut just as the thing crashed into the other side. The whole doorframe shuddered. Dust rained from above. The wood creaked and groaned, but it held, for now. I turned, my breath ragged, and froze. The room wasn't empty. Portraits lined the walls, hundreds of them. Painted faces stared back at me, their eyes too real, too knowing. Some looked frightened, others looked relieved. And then I saw it. My own face, a fresh painting, the paint still wet, as if it had been waiting for me. But my expression was wrong. My mouth was open in a silent scream, my eyes hollowed out. A shiver crawled down my spine. Behind me the door creaked, the lock bent. The thing outside wasn't giving up. Then something whispered behind me. "You don't belong here." I spun around. The portraits had changed, their eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared at me, black and endless. Then the whispering came again, closer. "Look!" A mirror stood in the corner of the room, a tall, ancient thing, its glass warped and cracked. I hesitated, but something pulled me forward. My reflection stared back, but it wasn't quite right. The room behind me was empty, the door was gone, and my reflection was smiling. I stepped back. My reflection didn't. The whispering grew frantic. The portraits seemed to shift, their empty faces stretching in silent warnings. Then my reflection reached out. Its fingers pushed against the glass, pressing outward, distorting the surface like water. I stumbled away, but the mirror pulsed, stretching open like a mouth. The thing outside slammed into the door again. Wood splintered. I had no choice. I reached forward and touched the mirror. Cold hands grabbed mine and pulled me through. The sensation was like sinking through ice. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My body twisted, weightless, as if I had fallen into deep water. Cold fingers dragged me forward, and suddenly, I was standing in a different room. It looked exactly like the one I had just left, but something was off. The colors were muted, washed out, like an old photograph. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something metallic. The portraits on the walls had changed again. They weren't empty anymore. They were watching me. The faces in the paintings shifted, their mouths moving soundlessly. Some stretched wide in screams, others twisted into knowing grins. My heart pounded as I backed away, but my reflection was still missing from the mirror. And then, I saw it. The door wasn't where it had been before. It was on the ceiling. A slow, shuffling sound echoed behind me. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The figures from the portraits were stepping out. They moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their feet barely touching the ground. Hollow eyes locked onto me, their mouths twitching as if struggling to form words. Then, in unison, they whispered, "You should not have come." My chest tightened. The door above me creaked open, revealing a gaping darkness beyond. Then the figures rushed toward me. I ran. There was no ladder, no stairs, just the impossible distance between me and the ceiling door. But as I reached out, the air thickened, pressing against my limbs like invisible hands trying to hold me down. The whispers turned into a low, droning chant. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes wide with hunger. I jumped. The air bent around me, and suddenly I was weightless again. I floated toward the ceiling, toward the darkness beyond the door. The figures below reached for me, their fingers just barely grazing my ankles. Then, I was through. I landed hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my house. But it wasn't my house anymore. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, stained with something dark. The furniture was draped in white sheets, untouched for decades. Dust swirled in the dim light. The doorbell rang. I turned, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, for the first time in weeks, someone was standing at the door. The figure at the door was wrong. Its shape was human, but its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its fingers were too long, stretching toward the door handle. The doorbell rang again, an impatient chime that echoed through the silent house. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. The handle twisted. The door swung open slowly, revealing the visitor in full. It wore an old-fashioned suit, the fabric frayed at the edges. Its skin was paper-thin, stretched tight over its skull. But its eyes were endless black pits, swallowing the dim light around them. Then it spoke. "You've been expected." The voice was a whisper, yet it filled the entire house, vibrating in my bones. I couldn't move. The visitor stepped inside, gliding rather than walking. The air turned thick, heavy with the scent of decay. "You've seen too much," it murmured. "Now you must choose." It raised one skeletal hand, palm up. In it, something small and round gleamed. A single, blood-red marble. "Take it," the visitor said, "and you will understand." My hands trembled as I reached forward. The moment my fingers closed around the marble, a wave of cold crashed over me. My vision blurred, the room twisting into shadows and smears of light. Then I was falling. No, sinking. Something was pulling me down, deeper and deeper into an abyss I couldn't see. The visitor's voice echoed around me. "Welcome home." When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my house anymore. I was standing in a long, endless hallway, lined with doors that stretched into the darkness. Each door was slightly open, revealing glimpses of impossible things. A room filled with mirrors, each reflecting a different version of me. A nursery, empty except for a crib rocking on its own. A dining room where shadowy figures sat around a feast of rotting food. Footsteps echoed behind me. I turned, and the visitor was there, smiling with too many teeth. "It's time to remember," it whispered. The visitor gestured toward the nearest door, the one where the mirrors rippled like water. "Step through," it murmured, "and see." I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but the hallway stretched endlessly behind me. There was no escape. With a shaking breath, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. I was surrounded by mirrors. Hundreds of them, each one reflected a different version of me. Older, younger, twisted, hollow-eyed, grinning too wide. Then one stepped forward. It wasn't me, it was something wearing my face. "You don't belong here," the reflection said, its voice a sickening echo of my own. "But I do." It stepped closer, its movement slightly off, as if it was learning how to walk in my skin. "Let's trade," it whispered. I stumbled back, but the glass behind me warped, pulling me in. My own reflection grinned, its eyes turning black. Then it lunged. I fell backward into the mirror. Cold engulfed me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The world twisted, the glass swallowing me whole. Then I was falling, and landed hard, gasping for air. I was back in the hallway. The visitor stood waiting, its grin wider than before. "One down," it murmured. "So many more to go." Before I could react, the next door creaked open. A nursery. The air inside smelled of dust and something sweet, like old baby powder. A crib stood in the center, rocking ever so slightly. A whisper drifted through the room, soft and sing-song. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Something shifted in the crib. I stepped closer. And then the blanket moved. The lullaby stopped. The thing under the blanket sat up. It wasn't a baby. It was something much, much older. The visitor's voice floated behind me. Some doors should never be opened. Certainly, here's how the story concludes. I stood frozen, my heart racing as the thing in the crib began to crawl toward me. Its face was smooth, featureless, an empty void where a human face should have been. Its limbs twisted unnaturally, and it moved with a jerky, twitching motion, like a puppet on frayed strings. The air grew thick, stifling, and I could hear the soft, distorted laughter of the visitor echoing from behind me. I needed to get out. I couldn't stay here. But every door in the hallway was now open, each one a portal to something worse, something darker. The visitor's voice rang out again, soft but filled with malice. You've come this far, but you will never leave. The house, it never lets go. The thing in the crib reached the edge of the room, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of its stare. You should have never opened that first door, the visitor whispered in my ear. Suddenly the room started to shift. The floor beneath me began to buckle and twist, and the walls began to pulse, like the heartbeat of some vast, unseen creature. The laughter grew louder, more frantic. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, or if there was even anywhere to go. The hallway stretched infinitely before me, and I could hear the creatures, things closing in. Their footsteps echoed behind me, each one louder than the last, growing closer. I stumbled through door after door, each one revealing worse horrors than the last. Rooms filled with shadows, places where time bent, spaces where every twisted version of myself reached out from the corners. They all whispered the same thing. You should have stayed asleep. I couldn't escape. I couldn't breathe. The house, the place that had once felt so familiar, was now a prison. The very walls seemed to be alive, pulling me in, suffocating me. Finally, I came to a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, it was locked. I banged on it, desperately trying to break free, and then a soft voice whispered from the other side. The house never forgets. I stopped. I knew who it was. My sister. She had never left. The visitor had been her all along, guiding me to this moment, forcing me to confront the truth. The guilt, the regret. It had never gone away. I had never been able to save her, and now she was trapped here with me, in this endless house of horrors. As I stood there, my hand on the door, I realized there was no way out. The door creaked open on its own, and I stepped through,